All right, deep divers, welcome back to the channel. Don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments. Today we're doing a deep dive into all the buzz around the new Romeo plus Juliet on Broadway. You know, the one with Kit Connor and Rachel Zegler. You guys sent us some great sources on this one, so let's jump right in. We're talking Gen Z style, Jack Antonoff's music, and a whole lot of opinions.
Yeah, it's exciting to see this kind of classic get such a bold update for a modern audience. There's definitely a lot to talk about.
For sure. So you sent us this review from the Daily Beast, and let's just say the critic, Tim Tiemann. He wasn't exactly head over heels for this one. He did give some praise to a couple of the supporting actors, specifically Gabby Beans. She plays Mercutio Romeo's best friend, and Tommy Dorfman as Tybalt Juliet's like hot-headed cousin. But when it came to Connor and Zegler as like the star-crossed lovers themselves, Tiemann felt like their chemistry was kind of missing.
And, when it comes to Romeo and Juliet, that chemistry is everything, right? The whole tragedy hinges on how intense their love is and the audience believing that connection. If that's not there, it kind of undermines the whole emotional core of the play.
Yeah, totally. Imagine watching Titanic without feeling the heat between Jack and Rose.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't work. So this lack of chemistry seems to be like at the heart of Tiemann's critique. But what's interesting is this whole production's also getting a lot of attention for its visuals. We're talking nightclub vibes, giant teddy bears, even shopping carts on stage. It's like Baz Luhrmann meets high school drama club.
Yeah, it's definitely a striking visual style, and I think it speaks to how the production is trying to make Romeo and Juliet relevant to a younger generation. They're using imagery and references that resonate with Gen Z culture.
Right. But it also raises the question, is it all style over substance? Could all this visual spectacle be distracting from Shakespeare's language and the themes of the play?
Yeah, that seems to be the debate a lot of critics are having. Some argue that this bold approach sacrifices depth for flashiness. Others might say it's breathing new life into a classic by making it visually engaging for a modern audience. It's fascinating to see how people are responding to this balancing act.
Speaking of balancing acts, let's talk about the casting choices. Kit Connor and Rachel Zegler are both huge stars, especially with Gen Z. But does that translate to stage presence? Can they embody these iconic roles? It's one thing to be a heartthrob on screen, but Shakespeare on Broadway is a whole different ballgame.
Oh, for sure. Shakespeare's language requires such a specific skill set and a certain understanding of rhythm and delivery. It's not just saying the words, it's about making them come alive and connecting with the audience on an emotional level.
Exactly, and that's where this whole question of celebrity casting comes in. Are Connor and Zegler bringing the depth to these roles, or are they relying on their existing fame to carry the production? It seems like Tiemann's reviews suggest the latter, which is interesting because just a few blocks away, there's another production in Juliet that's also playing with the Romeo and Juliet story, but in a completely different way.
Oh, and Juliet. That one takes a really interesting approach. It imagines what would happen if Juliet didn't die. It's a fun feminist twist on the classic, and it's been super successful. I think it highlights all the different ways you can adapt and reimagine Shakespeare for a modern audience.
Oh my gosh, imagine if this new Romeo plus Juliet had done something similar. Instead of ending in tragedy, maybe they just defy fate, escape the feud, and ride off into the sunset together on a Vespa. That's a Romeo and Juliet I'd want to see.
Now, that would be a twist. It really makes you think about how these different interpretations can speak to different generations and different cultural contexts. But it brings us back to this production's clear focus on Gen Z. From the casting to the aesthetic, it feels like they're trying to create a Romeo and Juliet that speaks directly to that audience.
Right, it's like they're saying, hey, Gen Z, this one's for you. Come see your favorite stars in a classic love story, but with a modern twist. But is that alienating other audiences who might not connect with that specific aesthetic? Or the cultural references?
That's a great point. It brings up so many questions about the future of theater and how to make these classic works connect with new generations without losing what makes them timeless. And that's something we're going to explore further in part 2 of this deep dive.
Awesome. So make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for part 2 where we unpack even more about this controversial and visually stunning Romeo plus Juliet.
So one of the most interesting things about this production is how it plays with identity. Like, some actors play multiple roles, blurring the lines between characters. It's a bold choice that adds another layer of complexity to the story.
Woo! Multiple roles. That sounds confusing, especially for anyone who isn't already super familiar with Romeo and Juliet. Like, imagine trying to keep up with Gabby Beans switching between Mercutio, Friar Lawrence, and even the Prince.
Yeah.
Talk about a quick change artist.
Yeah, it Definitely sounds like a challenge both for the actors and the audience. And if we go back to Tiemann's review, it seems like this element might not have been totally successful. He actually describes the production as like an off-putting game of, wait, who's that again? Which doesn't sound too promising.
Yikes. So maybe not the best choice for Shakespeare newbies then. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about something that really stood out to me. That whole Gen Z aesthetic we talked about. It's like they took Romeo and Juliet, threw it in a time machine, set it to 2024, and blasted some Billie Eilish in the background. Is this what it takes to make Shakespeare relevant to younger audiences these days?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, right? How do you make these classic works resonate with modern audiences without losing their essence? This production seems to be leaning heavily on aesthetics and star power. But is that enough?
Okay, so let's get real for a second. It feels like we've been dancing around the elephant in the room, Connor and Zegler. Are they the modern-day Romeo and Juliet, or is it all hype and no heart?
Yeah, Tiemann was pretty blunt about their lack of chemistry. He pointed out that while there might be some surface-level flirtation, the deeper connection, the raw, passionate love that makes Romeo and Juliet so tragic just wasn't there.
Yeah, it's almost like the production itself is mirroring that disconnect, right?
Yeah.
We've got this visually stunning spectacle, a daring approach to characterization,
Yeah.
and a soundtrack that screams Gen Z. But are we feeling the love, the raw emotion that makes this story so powerful?
Exactly. Romeo and Juliet is a story that hinges on that intensity, that believability of their love. Without it, you're left with a beautifully crafted shell but no beating heart.
Which seems to be the main critique here. It's all style over substance. But hey, maybe that's enough for some people. Maybe they just want a fun night out, some flashy visuals, and a chance to see their favorite stars on stage.
That's certainly possible, but it does raise the question of whether this kind of adaptation truly serves the play, or if it's just using Shakespeare as a vehicle for something else.
Now that's a thought-provoking point. So what does this all mean for the future of Shakespeare on Broadway? Is this the new normal or just a blip on the radar?
It's hard to say for sure. This production is definitely pushing boundaries and sparking conversations, but whether it has a lasting impact on how Shakespeare is interpreted and staged remains to be seen. What we do know is that it's gotten people talking, and that's never a bad thing when it comes to theater.
Totally. And speaking of talking, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this Gen Z-ified Romeo and Juliet? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's keep this conversation going in the comments. Now let's wrap up this deep dive with some final thoughts in part 3.
You know, even if this production isn't for everyone, there's something to be said for its willingness to take risks. Like that scene you mentioned where Romeo does a pull-up to reach Juliet in her suspended bed. It's definitely a memorable image.
I know, right? Shakespeare just got a gym membership. It definitely seems like they weren't afraid to shake things up with the staging, even if the overall effect is, as we said, a bit divisive.
Exactly. And it makes me think about a question we often face when reimagining these classic works. Is it better to have a bold experimental production that might divide audiences, or play it safe and risk being forgotten?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's like that age-old question. Is it better to have loved and lost and never to have loved at all? But in this case, it's more like, is it better to have a daring, controversial Romeo and Juliet than a bland, forgettable one?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And ultimately, this production has definitely achieved one thing. It's gotten people talking, it sparked debate, challenged expectations, and reminded us that even a story as old as time can still surprise us.
For sure. Love it or hate it, this Romeo plus Juliet is making waves. It's a bold experiment that might not totally work, but it's pushing the boundaries of what a Shakespeare adaptation can be.
And isn't that what theater is all about? Provoking thought, sparking conversations, and making us see the world in new ways, even if it's through a haze of neon lights and a thumping bass line.
Well said. So Deep Divers, that wraps up our deep dive into the whirlwind that is Romeo plus Juliet on Broadway. We covered the highs, the lows, the head-scratching moments, and those jaw-dropping visuals. What do you think? Did this production capture the heart of Romeo and Juliet, or did it totally miss the mark? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's keep this conversation going in the comments below.